Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So today we're going to do some very basic edits to the front page, just to demonstrate that this is actually very easy and won't mess up your entire web page. I've used other web services in the past for other websites, and just changing the front text like this, especially with an overlay picture, let alone an overlay video, could throw the formatting of the entire thing out of whack. But as you can see here, each text and video element is independent, so just titling the 14th century living history section there for Paladins of Chivalry, and then filling in the Our Services bit, just briefly describing what we do. All very nice and easy, and you might think, well, that's fairly simple, and it should be, and well, yes, it is, luckily. But you've also got these drop-down menus, which will go with the Our Services section once I finish writing a few lines. Now, these can be quite interesting because, of course, they are dynamic elements, but as you're about to see, when you click on them, you get the titles, and you can just edit the title very nice and easily, and do that for all three. And yes, living history and reenactment are subtly different. They often coincide, but they are very much slightly different things that add some education as well, and we're ready to go. It's really that easy to edit a website. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. Last month, I was invited to the Tank Museum. Now, some of you will probably have seen I've already filmed a top 5 and bottom 5 tanks with the Tank Museum regarding tanks that have some form of naval or maritime or at least amphibious connection. But at Tankfest, I was basically allowed to wander around and do pretty much whatever I liked. So obviously, I did some filming of the Tiger Day event, as you can see here. But I also thought I would be cunning and use the opportunity when everybody disappeared to the arena at the start of the Tiger display, because obviously they wanted to watch the Tiger, to go in and do a bit of filming inside the Tank Museum about various tanks and how the Navy, particularly the Royal Navy when it comes to British tanks, and the development of tanks themselves are interlinked. And of course, how that eventually diverged as tanks became very much an independent creation of the army. But you might be surprised at just how much the Royal Navy had to do with the invention and early development of the tank. Now, a quick word of warning, of course, the Tank Museum is an active museum. It was open on the day I was filming. Most people were outside, but not all, and of course the Tank Museum has a bunch of audio-visual displays to go with the static tanks themselves. So there is a degree of background noise, a little bit above and beyond a lot of my usual live recordings. So hopefully you'll bear with me with that. I was using a fairly high-end lavalier mic, so hopefully most of that noise is reduced just to a general hubbub in the background and I'm still relatively clear. But do let me know in the comments below if you'd like me to go back and re-record with the Tank Museum when it's a little bit quieter and perhaps at more length, and then maybe I'll turn it into a Wednesday video where we can look at tanks and the Navy and various encounters between tanks and the Navy in a little bit more detail. So with that said, shall we proceed?
Now, it might interest you to know that the story of the tank doesn't begin with tracked vehicles, but it does begin with the Navy. Now, unfortunately, even the Tank Museum, at least as far as I can tell, doesn't have a copy of one of the original armoured cars from 1914. This is a Rolls-Royce armoured car from 1920, but it's about as close as we're likely to get. Now, the reason why the tank really starts with a vehicle sort of like this is actually the Royal Navy Air Service. The Royal Navy Air Service, along with the Royal Flying Corps, made up what at the time were essentially two competing air forces for the British Armed Forces. Obviously, the Royal Naval Air Service, as the name suggests, was a part of the Royal Navy, but they'd been deployed to the Western Front to see what they could do to help out in the aerial conflict. Now, this led to a bit of a problem, because in the 19th century, naval brigades had been deployed, but it was quite clear that any naval brigade made up of a few thousand sailors was not going to make the slightest bit of difference on a battlefront that stretched for hundreds of miles and involved millions of men, which meant that the RNAS's presence on their airfields and in the local area was relatively minimal in terms of manpower. So they needed a way to get around relatively quickly, and they needed a way to keep themselves alive for doing that, because one or two casualties would have a disproportionately large effect compared to that impact on an infantry unit. And so somebody went, well, I've got this car, why don't I strap some armour on it, and while I'm at it, why don't I strap a machine gun to it? And someone thought, well, that's a good idea, and very soon the RNAS was known for touring around Belgium and northern France in early armoured cars. So this was the first armoured fighting vehicle, if you like, at least of the modern armoured fighting vehicle developmental line. I mean, you can point to Hussite war wagons and things like that in the past, but those had died out, and now the idea of fighting behind armour in some kind of propelled transport had re-emerged. Now, having seen this, various people decided maybe this idea is worth taking a little bit further, because obviously trench warfare was breaking out on the Western Front, everything was getting bogged down very badly. People needed a way to try and break the impasse that didn't involve charging headlong into lots of machine gun fire and artillery fire, and, well, later on it would be gas, but that hadn't happened quite yet. And so when, bizarrely enough of all people, Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, so there's another naval connection, decided that he was going to try and solve the problem of the trenches, it was in part to the RNAS and their experience with armoured cars that he would look to try and provide the larger solution to the whole battlefield.
The Landship Committee was thus formed, and then had to deal with a variety of rather interesting proposals, some more serious than others. And yes, this is a tricycle-wheeled battle machine powered by a submarine engine armed with an main gun battery that would make most period destroyers jealous, but this was presented more as a bit of a joke at one point, as one of the naval officers involved on the Landship Committee realised that things were rapidly escalating into absurdity. That's not to say that there weren't some proposals that were actually serious, but also truly absurd, like this gigantic thing which looks like something out of Robot Wars, except that, as you can see from the scale, it's about the size of a large building and made entirely of concrete. They also had to debate whether or not wheeled or tracked propulsion was better for the muddy trenches of the Western Front, and a number of prototype vehicles were tested just to work out the differences between these two forms of propulsion before they settled on something they could actually possibly use on the battlefield itself.
Well, as we've seen, the Landship Committee worked on a variety of different proposals, both tracked and wheeled, but this was one of the first solid things to come out of the programme, quite literally. A lot of the stuff had been what we would today call vaporware. There had been a few prototypes around, but this was the first thing they were actually relatively confident in. Pretty much known to most people these days as Little Willie. This is the starter for 10 for tank design. You can see it's got tracks, it's got a structure on top. It's not armed, but it could be, at least with small arms. The main problem with this was it wasn't long enough to cross trenches, it wasn't big enough to be armed with anything particularly substantial, but it was a good prototype to show the principle that tracked propulsion was superior to wheeled propulsion, which it did quite well, and that's what led on to the first combat tanks. So once they decided what kind of tank they were actually going to build, they came up with this, the Mark I. Now, the key thing with the Mark I that distinguishes it from other tanks when it comes to the naval features is specifically this, the 6-pounder gun. The 6-pounder gun was actually naval surplus. The Navy had long moved past actually using the 6-pounder. Even the 12-pounder, which was Dreadnought's secondary battery, was old news by World War I. So there were plenty in stock, and the Navy wasn't too afraid of giving the Army as many as they wanted. The big problem with the 6-pounder, though, in the trenches was, as you can see, it's relatively long barrel, because as a Navy weapon it has to shoot at long range, and the long 6-pounder barrels kept digging into the mud whenever the tank went up and down in trenches. And so that moves us on to the next version. The solution they arrived at can be seen here. This is a Mark V tank. There's a Mark IV just off to the left as well, which has the same thing. And you'll notice it's still got the same 6-pounder, but now the 6-pounder has been cut short. And later on they would actually produce 6-pounders with this much shorter barrel, but the initial tanks after the long barrel Mark Is were still naval 6-pounders, just with everything shortened a bit. And as you can see now, if the tank dips down, even if this goes all the way down to the lower part of the casement here, so it's sticking down like this, that is still, a couple of feet clear of the tracks. which means if the tracks dig into the mud, you're still not going to get the barrel stuck in there. Whereas if this was its original length and the barrel was all the way down, the barrel's going to be going around about here. So you can see how they'd end up with the grounding issues. And just as you had transport ships at sea, they very quickly decided that the Landship was going to need a transport version as well. So this is basically your first armoured personnel carrier, the Mark 9 troop transporting tank. It's so long it can't even quite fit in the picture, even though I've got the camera back as far as you can before the Mark 5 and the walls start interfering. And although it's a transport tank and therefore lacks a main gun, i.e. a primary battery, a main battery, you still actually technically have a secondary battery. Much as warships at the time had a casement battery of usually 6-inch guns or thereabouts, even the transport tank have these little firing slits, or firing ports, I guess, so troops could fire out. So if you like, the secondary battery of this tank is a bunch of 303 Lee Enfields, fittingly enough shooting out the sides, much like the secondary battery on a warship. And by the time you get to the Mark 8, the International, a joint Anglo-American design, the idea of land ships, I think, is getting a little bit silly, because at this point, not only has it gotten so long, kind of like that transport tank, that the length to beam ratio is approaching that of a warship, but as you can see, it's even started to develop its own superstructure. I mean, whatever next? Multiple turrets? Well, you may have spoken too soon, because, well, the independent heavy tank A1E1, whilst you had the Landship Committee that developed tanks at the beginning of World War I, this was sometimes nicknamed a land battleship, and for good reason. I mean, okay, it's not actually that much bigger than a Mark IV or a Mark V or whatever, but what it does star is multiple turrets, like a seagoing warship. You've got the main turret up there, so your main battery, and then in this case, the secondary battery is a whole array of machine guns. Now, it's on a much smaller scale than a warship, but it theoretically follows the similar line of thought, and hence that's why it's dubbed a land battleship. It didn't go anywhere literally and figuratively, because it turned out to be far too impractical, far too unwieldy, far too unreliable, and just generally a terrible idea, as most multi-turreted tanks turned out to be. I mean, also, as we all know, by this stage, this is the 1920s. If you're going to be properly imitating a warship, you need 2 turrets superfiring up front and at least 1 at the back, if not 2 superfiring aft. So really what we should have is this thing right forward, maybe one of the machine guns superfiring above it, and then a machine gun or turret or 2 superfiring aft. I mean, that probably wouldn't have made it any better. In fact, it probably would have made it actively a lot worse. That actually would be fairly difficult, but I'm sure they could have invented some way of making it worse, but at least it would have looked the part, and maybe they could have stolen the superstructure from that Mark 8, and then would have had a true land battleship. But fortunately for everybody, this wasn't long for this world. And yes, sometimes the experiments with making tanks meet water didn't really work out that well. Here's a British attempt in the 1930s, and yes, this is crumple zone damage to the front of a tank. Again, I've covered this in my bottom 5 tanks on my video with the Tank Museum, but let's just say, essentially no armour. This is basically a free shrapnel creation unit for the enemy. These things leak. Also, they'll set themselves on fire when they're hit. Let's just not go there. And at the end of the interwar period, you have, of course, this thing, TOG 2. Everyone knows and loves TOG. TOG is long, TOG is number 2, TOG is great. TOG is also technically HMS TOG, but we won't go there. Anyway, the reason TOG 2 to a certain extent represents the end of direct naval involvement in overall tank design is because we covered earlier, the Royal Navy had a huge hand in the early development of tanks. Fast forward to the end of the 1930s, and you have the old gang, TOG, hence TOG, and they're worried that the Army's tanks won't really stand up to German tanks, so they designed this thing, and a lot of the people who were on the original Landship Committee are also involved in the development of first TOG 1 and then TOG 2. Sir D'Encourt, or however now you pronounce his name, even naval historians can't necessarily quite agree, but he was the director of naval construction in World War I, and we've mentioned him earlier in the development of the World War I tanks. He and, as I said, most of the other members of the Landship Committee who are still around are sitting on the development committee for TOG 2, which partially explains why she resembles an evolved form of the Mark 8 Independent or International, partly why she also has a number of other naval features, as I've mentioned in my top 5 tanks with the Tank Museum. Again, go and watch that video if you'd like. And also why she represents the end of naval involvement directly in British tank development. Because after this, the former members of the Landship Committee would no longer design any further tanks, and tank design was much, much more done by the Army and by independent companies. But, well, for all its theoretical faults, I still would have liked to have seen a fleet of these things go out in the early part of World War II. I mean, it can't have gone much worse than some of the tanks we ended up actually putting in the field, to be perfectly honest. Now, granted, by World War II, naval influence on tank design had officially waned. There weren't large contingents of naval personnel at the head of tank design bureaus anymore, at least in the UK. But the naval influence on tanks continued to be seen in a variety of ways. This is a relatively unassuming A9 cruiser tank, and to be fair, there isn't a huge amount here that you can directly point to and say this is specifically naval related. I mean, maybe you can make an argument that it's riveted, but that's more a reflection of the state of British industry at the time than anything else. No, the main reason that this reflects a continuing naval legacy when it comes to tanks is its name. Not the A9 part, but the cruiser part, because obviously what's the naval mission of a cruiser? To rove about at high speed, destroy and interdict the enemy, but not to engage the battleships. What's the job of the A9 cruiser and other cruiser tanks, apart from the fact they're using exactly the same name in the British Army? It's to rove about at high speed and engage the enemy, but not to engage the equivalent of battleships on land, the really heavy stuff, that they'll leave to the artillery or just general advances by the infantry and things like the Matilda II. And so you can see how the naval influence is still felt within the tank regiments, at least within the British Army. And I mean, apart from anything else, is the fact what do you call a group of tanks? What do you call your whole body of tanks? It's a fleet. Again, a naval term. And since we were next to the A9, let's just swivel 180. Here's the Matilda II, and this is obviously an infantry tank, so it's slow but much more heavily armoured. Not particularly that much better armed, to be perfectly honest, but although it's reflecting the British ideals of land warfare, it kind of still shows a little bit of a naval paradigm with the cruiser tank, as we said, the fast, high-speed, scouty vehicle, and the Matilda, which is effectively standing in as the battleship tank. Slow, heavily armed, grinds forward, takes and holds, as opposed to the cruiser, which is just designed to look around and occasionally blow things up. Of course, not all naval involvement with tanks went particularly well. If you've seen my video with the Tank Museum, you'll know my opinion on this thing. This is the Ha-Go, a Japanese tank that was used by the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy. And some people pointed out, well, you know, it wasn't an awful tank when it was first developed, which is technically true. It wasn't the best at the time, but by the time the Japanese Navy was using them in World War II, when they really should have developed something a bit better, yeah, this thing was a little bit pathetic. Boys anti-tank rifles, Matilda IIs, sharp sticks, heavily thrown rocks, pretty much anything would avail you when you were fighting a Ha-Go. And this was in 1944, a time when you had Tiger IIs and Sherman Fireflies and IS-1s floating around in Europe. So yeah, Japanese Navy didn't make the best choice when they decided this was going to remain their main operational tank during the Second World War. They did have some slightly better ones floating around, although not literally. The bigger and better ones tended to sink rather alarmingly, but they were in the minority as opposed to this thing, much to the regret, I'm sure, of many Japanese tank crew, but much to the delight of many Allied troops. And then, of course, there are the attempts to make tanks go swimming. This is the Sherman DD tank. Again, some of you may have seen me commenting on this already. Suffice to say, whilst it worked okay in rivers, as long as you could find slopes shallow enough at either end, and whilst it worked in relatively calm seas, and if you could deploy it close enough to shore, it did have problems operating in any kind of strong current, or indeed in any kind of waves larger than what you would consider calm for a beach, which rather limited its utility unless you wanted to drown rather horribly. but it did pioneer the use of these collapsible skirts. Now, the idea of collapsible skirts to make a tank amphibious didn't really last very long past World War II. There were a few tanks that would try it later on, but by and large, most tanks gave up as a bad idea. But still, whilst there may have been some better solutions they could have tried, it did okay. But it's worth noting that, of course, this was kind of the halfway house between the Navy and the tank. The tank was very much an army thing, at least this particular version, but the Navy was the ones who were having to drop them off to go and invade Europe and various other places. Now, tanks and ships of the Navy weren't always interacting in friendly or even semi-friendly ways. A lot of the time they were interacting in very, very hostile ways. And unfortunately, the main connection our good old friend here, the Panzer IV, has with the Navy is being horribly abused by the Navy, and this kind of bookends the entire war, or at least the active parts of it. During the dying days of the battle for France, during the evacuations off of the northern French coast, there's an account from a Royal Navy destroyer that had come into a harbour to collect troops and see if there was anything or anyone else that could be evacuated, and it was engaged by enemy tanks, including some Panzer IVs. Of course, the Panzer IV that engaged that tank would have had a shorter barrel gun most likely, but this is a Panzer IV, it's close enough. Now, a destroyer is not particularly armoured, but it does usually carry 4 or 4.7-inch guns, in this case it's a British destroyer, which significantly outgun the 75mm short barrel, medium barrel or long barrel that you'd find on a Panzer IV. And of course there'd be at least 4 of them as opposed to the Panzer IV's 1, but there were a lot of tanks, and destroyers, as I said, they're not particularly armoured, so even 75mm gunfire could pose a significant risk if enough of it hit home, and indeed machine gun fire, sniper fire and the occasional tank round were taking their toll of the crew of various destroyers. But one particular Panzer IV had the misfortune, probably through not knowing the engagement was happening, to wander out from between a row of buildings and onto a quay or wharf just along from the destroyer. The tank commander saw what was happening, and he decided to take some pot shots, presumably with some kind of cupola-mounted machine gun. The destroyer took exception to this, and whilst the tank was desperately trying to bring its turret round, the destroyer was faster at bringing its gun round and put a round straight into the side of the Panzer IV. Now, bear in mind this is a British destroyer circa the evacuation of Dunkirk. We're probably talking about a 4.7-inch shell. The sailor who gave the account wasn't part of the gun crew, he was on the bridge, so he doesn't know exactly what kind of shell was fired, whether it be pure high explosive or something else. But the main effect of that impact was that apparently the tank was just hitting the side and pitched clean off the wharf or quay and straight into the water. So that didn't end particularly well for the poor old Panzer IV. At the same time, during operations during D-Day and just after, naval gunfire support was frequently called in to deal with concentrations of German armour near the coast. That could usually be reported as Tigers, but was probably a mix of the occasional Tiger, lots of Panzer IVs, maybe a Panther or two, who knows. But, well, it turns out none of those tanks last very long when they had 6-inch, 8-inch or worse fired at them. And, well, you would have heard during my video on Operation Neptune that Warspite at one point sent 50 rounds of 15-inch rapid fire in at a German armoured formation, and HMS Rodney did the same, well, not 50 rounds, but against German armour would use its main guns, the 16-inch guns. Now, okay, you're not going to direct hit a tank except by blind luck, but even hitting near a tank with a 15 or 16-inch round would pretty much destroy the tank. But very occasionally statistics won out and you would get a direct hit or near enough. And there are a number of photos from the Normandy campaign which show what's probably a Panzer IV, or at least what's left of it, after such a direct hit. Of course, exactly what tank it was is rather difficult to discern, as you'll see now. So, sorry Panzer IV, but you were a little bit of a victim when it came to the naval tank interactions. Now, another element of naval technology working its way into tanks is present here. So this is obviously the Tiger II. Occasionally some people call it the Königstiger, but you all know what it is. It's a pretty recognizable silhouette. Now, if you've seen my video with the Tank Museum, you'll know that the Tiger I was on my list, one of the two lists anyway, and well, we're at the Tiger II because we're pointing at basically the same kind of thing, the 88mm gun. This is by a little bit of dissent, actually very closely related to a naval gun, because back in World War I, the Kaiserliche Marine used the 8.8 centimeter or 88 millimeter -45, so 45 caliber long weapon, as mainly a tertiary weapon on battleships and as a secondary weapon on some of the smaller cruisers. It was obviously a long-range, relatively high-velocity weapon, so when the first aircraft started to show up and the German army decided, right, we need a decent anti-aircraft weapon, they turned to the Kaiserliche Marine's weapon, and the 8.8 centimeter -45 became the Flak 16 after a little bit of development. The Flak 16 being the first 88 millimeter anti-aircraft gun that the German army would field. Via a few iterations, you eventually end up with the Flak 36, which is the famous or infamous, depending on which side of the conflict you're on, German 88 millimeter anti-aircraft gun turned anti-tank gun of the early part of the Second World War. And from that weapon was derived the 88 mil, which went into the Tiger I, and then obviously later on with further development, the 88 mil goes into the Tiger II as well. So although it's been developed somewhat from the 8.8 centimeter -45 of the Kaiserliche Marine, it's not too far removed. In fact, a number of 88 mil guns that were used on U-boats and so forth in World War II were either World War I 88 mils that had been reconditioned, or newer 88 mils that could use ammunition that was compatible with old World War I 88 mils. So although the performance statistics are a bit different, mechanically, functionally overall, there's much less difference between this 88 mil and the 88 mil you might find on the König, for example, than you might otherwise think. Another element of naval influence or naval involvement with tanks in World War II is reflected with this vehicle. This is a T-34-85. Now, ordinarily I would have chosen to film next to the T-34-76, which is in another one of the halls. Unfortunately, that T-34-76 was captured, so it has swastikas daubed on the side of it, so yeah, that's not going live. But yeah, anyway, the T-34, what connection is that to naval involvement? Well, not directly, but more of the T-34 getting involved in naval elements rather than Navy getting involved in the T-34. Specifically, the Russians decided to build a series of river gunboats, and they took turrets from their T-34 tanks and stuck them on the gunboats because it gave them a decent gun that they could use to fire on enemy forces. Plus, it was obviously already armoured, which gave the gunners a significant degree of protection, much better than open mount or splinter mounted turrets on regular gunboats. And they sailed happily up and down the rivers of Eastern Europe, or unhappily, again, depending on whose side you were on, shooting out things and generally making a nuisance of themselves, also acting as amphibious landing craft occasionally, because why not? And obviously it wasn't always the Navy coming to the tank. Sometimes the tanks came from the Navy to the shore, or in this case, well, it's not technically a tank, it's an armoured fighting vehicle, the LVT-4 Buffalo, an armoured landing craft, very much more shaped like a boat, roughly, than most tanks are, as you can probably tell, somewhat taller, and this was just designed to transport infantry from ships to the shore. As some of you pointed out previously, yes, that up forward is a 20mm Oerlikon, which gives it another naval connection, because of course the 20mm Oerlikon was primarily used by the navies in World War II, whereas the Air Force 20mm, at least for the Western Allies, was the Hispano. And then the troops would get out the back and everyone would start fighting on land, and that's kind of where the interest of a naval historian ends. Now, here's one tank that doesn't have naval involvement at all, but you might think it does. This is, of course, the Jagdtiger. Now, the Jagdtiger is armed with a 128mm gun, and some of you might be thinking, oh, hang on, Drac, I know where you're going with this. The 88mm is derived from a Kaiserliche Marine gun. We know the Kriegsmarine had a bunch of 128mm guns on their destroyers. So is this a naval-derived 128mm? No. No, unfortunately, whilst there was a design lineage that also involved the 128mm, which were partially considered in very initial stages as armament for the Jagdtiger, that particular line was not selected. And in fact, the 128mm that's installed on the Jagdtiger is purely a new design. So although it shares the same caliber, there's actually nothing beyond the caliber that matches. Diverting briefly out of the Channel's time period, this is an example they have which, well, it demonstrates where things were going. After everyone decided, skirted tanks aren't really the thing for amphibious operations, at least for river crossing operations. This big snorkel here on this T-72 is how most modern tanks would cross a river. I mean, in theory, I guess you could chuck this off of a landing barge and hope that it will not land in water deeper than, what's that, about 15 to 20 feet. But I wouldn't want to be the tank crew that tries it. Nonetheless, these days also tanks are fully sealed. Whereas back then, if you wanted to use a snorkel on a tank, you generally also had to seal the tank up with bits of rubber and so forth prior to entering the water. So that's just how it's resolved ever since. And I mean, okay, it's a little bit of a stretch, but snorkels, submarines, naval, yes, no, maybe.
And so we approach the end of our selection of tanks, at least for this initial look at the relationship between the Navy and various tanks. There's a Swedish tank just there, which is one of the few post-World War II full tanks that had amphibious capability via some form of skirting. But as we pan across, you'll see the Beach Armoured Recovery Vehicle. Clues in the name, it goes on the beach, it is vaguely naval related, and I am rather taken by this massive superstructure it has on top. But now, just coming into view, is one of the T-54-55 series, and that's another post-war naval involvement in tank design, specifically because it has the D-10T 100mm gun, which is obviously a Soviet anti-aircraft maybe dual-purpose weapon that was installed in a variety of Soviet warships around the World War II period. And of course, as an anti-aircraft weapon, it was fast-firing and high velocity, which is exactly the kind of features you want in a tank gun, and so they repurposed the design for use in the T-54-55 series. And as you can see as we pan across this column, while there are some other tanks in the foreground, you will see the distinctive round turrets of Soviet tank design, which lets you know that there are quite a number of T-54-55s over here in the Bovington tank collection, as well as you can see, quite a number of other tanks. This is the Vehicle Conservation Centre. They did offer to let me get down in there and actually film up close as I did with all the other tanks that were on the more public display areas, but that would have been, I thought, a little bit of an imposition on them, especially considering there were a lot of people who were looking at it from the public viewing area, both up here where I'm filming from and down where they had the railings. So it's just easier to show you all the different T-54-55s they have in stock, except the one that's got the cutouts, which you'll have seen if you've seen my top 5 tanks involved with naval and maritime things that I've done with the Tank Museum. So that's the Vehicle Conservation Centre. That's the pretty much conclusion of this particular video. Let me know in the comments below if you thought this was a good idea, if you enjoyed it, and if you'd like me to maybe go back and do a more extensive coverage of it. And of course, many thanks to the Tank Museum in Bovington for letting me come down and do the filming in the first place. And if you would like to go and have a look at some tanks yourself, tanks running around and tanks in the museum proper, there is of course Tankfest, which has a few tickets still available, which is coming up at the end of June, so just under 2 months from the time of release of this video, and I will be there at Tankfest, again as a guest of the Tank Museum, so you don't have to worry about tracking me down. I will apparently have an official meet and greet table, exact time and schedule to be published by the Tank Museum later on. So if you are heading there, or you may be planning to head there now, well, you can come and say hello and we can have a chat about warships and tanks and warships and how the two interrelate. So with that said, thanks for listening and see you again in another video.